tu tare ture Mangalam Shri Mahapani Swaha.
Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to Lama Live and Tashi Delek. It's such an honor to be with you for this first session of the Tibetan New Year. I'm Dr. Jean Carroll, joining you live from Sussex, England, and I'm delighted to be here with you from all around the world. If you like, you can let us know where you're tuning in from to help us all settle in together. At Tara Mandala, we're committed to being a welcoming, open and safe community for practitioners and students of all cultures and every race, religion, gender, sexuality, age, ability and circumstance. Today we're joined by Dr. Amelia Hall for a timely exploration of how to meet uncertainty with wisdom and compassion through the Buddhist philosophy of Madhyamaka, as developed by Nagarjuna. Rather than being abstract or philosophical in a distant way, these teachings on emptiness show us that because nothing has a fixed, independent essence, everything is workable, responsive, and open to change. By understanding how all things arise through interdependence, we can soften rigid positions, move beyond cultural divisions, and learn to work with reality as it actually is, rather than as we wish it to be. Dr. Amelia Hall is a core associate professor of Buddhism and the Dean of Graduate Programs at Naropa University, where she teaches across undergraduate and postgraduate programs. She's also an in-house editor and translator for the Kensei Vision Project. Amelia brings deep training in Buddhist philosophy and a gift for making these profound teachings accessible for contemporary practitioners navigating modern chaos. Whether you're brand new to Madhyamaka or deepening a long-standing connection with these teachings, today's session is an invitation to meet our turbulent times with greater clarity, resilience, and an open heart. As always, we warmly welcome donations directly to the teacher in appreciation of the teaching and as a practice of generosity. And now it's my great pleasure to welcome our teacher, Dr. Amelia Hall. Over to you, Amelia.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's always delightful to be here for Tara Mandala. Happy New Year for those of you who celebrate the Lunar New Year, galloping in on a fire horse. And yes, a lot of gratitude to be invited to teach, come back and teach for Tara Mandala. And of course, such gratitude to Lama Tsultrim for her teachings, for Tara Mandala, for this community. And Lama Tsultrim asked me, will you teach Madhyamaka? And I was like, and because this is such a deeply studied philosophy and seemingly difficult and complex, but at the same time, I just think this is really timely. So I'm very grateful to be here and to give you an introduction to what the course, which is coming up, I think it starts next week on the 27th of February. What is it? What is this philosophy? Why is it relevant? Why would I want to learn about this? So I'm really grateful to be here and to explore this with you. But before we do this, let's just take a moment to settle and be together. Find a comfortable seat. Allow your eyes to soften or even close gently. Take a full breath. Breathing in whatever is here and breathing out whatever you're ready to release. So I just want to sit with all of you in this moment. I'm not used to this format, and I can't see any of the people who are here. I don't know if it's possible for me to see people's comments or chats or things like that, but I don't know if that's possible on this format. But I'm feeling you in the space, wherever you all are, whether you're watching this now or later. So I just want to encourage you to notice what's present right now, and not what should be present, but what is actually happening, what's actually here in this moment. There's sensation, there's sound, there's the weight of your own attention. And now notice, even this moment of quiet awareness is moving. Thoughts arise and pass. The quality of your attention shifts. Nothing holds perfectly still. There's always a ceaseless arising and passing. And this is where our inquiry is really beginning. So if your eyes are closed, you can slowly begin to open them. And before I go deep into this, as always, I want to generate bodhicitta, the awakened heart mind, that whatever we're doing out of compassion, and we're generating whatever we can for the sake of all beings. And this is really important. This generation, this aspiration to really activate that compassionate heart and go out in the world and help. And that doesn't always mean jump into action. It also means generating this quality in yourself. And how do we do that when things are so unstable, when there's such instability and this lack of ground? So that's what we're going to be looking at in this course, and that's what I'm going to introduce you to today. So I want to start by saying, or naming something directly, is that learning about this Buddhist philosophical system, Madhyamaka, this philosophical tradition that we'll be exploring together, it's been described as some of the most rigorous and demanding school of thought within Buddhism. Nagarjuna, its principal architect within Buddhism, was a philosopher capable of dismantling almost any position one could hold, including positions that you might think are safely Buddhist. So why are we studying this now? Why are we offering this course now and looking at this philosophy now? Because sometimes the most demanding path is also the most liberating one. And because I think these teachings developed around the 2nd century in India have something urgent to offer us right now in this particular time. So starting from next week, over the next 5 weeks, I'm leading this course through this profound philosophical terrain of Buddhism. And we'll try, and this is a commitment that I'm making to you. We'll try not just to understand this material intellectually, but to let it land somewhere deeper. And to see how we can change, or how to let it change the way that we move through our lives. So the problem that we're starting with is the ground beneath our feet. So let's start with this. So sit with this question and sit with it rather than immediately answer it. How do we cultivate compassion and resilience without solid ground beneath our feet? And let that land. It's not a rhetorical question. It's the central practical challenge of learning about this philosophy and what we're going to be looking at in this course. And I think many of us are encountering this in our lives. We're living through a time of extraordinary turbulence. Political, social, ecological. Old certainties are dissolving. Institutions we relied upon feel unstable. Our environment, we're being saturated with information, with competing narratives, that even agreeing on what maybe seem like even basic facts feels sort of impossible. In response to this instability, most of us do one of two things. We try to find something to hold on to, some identity or ideology or group that has the seeming promise of solidity. Or we kind of drift into a kind of nihilism, a nothingness. Nothing is certain, nothing holds. Why try to hold anything? Why care about anything? So Madhyamaka, which means the middle way, it sort of refutes both of those options. It doesn't promise solid ground, but it doesn't leave you groundless either. The best way that the best kind of quote or teaching that really captures this is one from the founder of Naropa University, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. Many of you who know his teachings might be familiar with it. It's a pretty famous one, but it really captures this quote from one of his teachings where he says, the bad news is you're falling through the sky without a parachute. The good news is there's no ground. So what this philosophy is pointing to is this middle way between how we respond to turbulence, to chaos. We either try and hold on to something that's going to make us feel safe and give us a solid ground, or we just sort of drift off and nothing matters. And what we're trying to do is what's in between that? What is actually in between that? So this is why are we doing this now? Why is it important to learn these teachings, or why are we offering it now? Because I think we're feeling like this. We all feel very unstable. We keep trying to turn somewhere and everything feels like it's disintegrating or falling apart, or the ground feels very unstable. So that's the why. And then I'll give you a kind of brief map of the terrain that we'll be covering, the philosophical landscape, let's say, that we'll be moving through. So if you've encountered Indo-Tibetan Buddhist teachings before, you've likely been introduced what's called a framework that is called the three turnings of the wheel. And this is a framework for understanding how the Buddha's teachings developed and deepened over time. It's not the only framework. It's not, or Buddhist traditions follow this, but this is particularly an Indo-Tibetan framework of the 3 turnings. The first turning of the wheel gives us the foundational teachings, the 4 Noble Truths, the 5 aggregates, and the beginning of understanding how suffering works and how to work with it. And these are teachings rooted in what we might call careful psychological analysis. So in the beginning, the first turning, those teachings start to pull apart a deeply held sense of a permanent fixed self. The philosophy of Madhyamaka, the middle way, the second turning, and this is where what we're talking about today and what the course that we're offering is centered on, it kind of radicalizes this. In the second turning, even those components are revealed to have no inherent existence. So we start in the first turning with this sense of, okay, there's this self and there's this process, and we can start to pull it apart. And then in the second turning teachings, the second turning of the wheel, there's a sort of radical deconstruction of that. But here's the central insight. Emptiness is not nothing. And that's also what we're going to be exploring. And where does this come from? So our primary focus, our primary source for this is a Buddhist figure called Nagarjuna, some say Nagarjuna, who lived in India around the 2nd century CE, the Common Era. Now, through biographical sources, we have some really just wonderfully unreliable historical sources. Some sources give his lifespan as 600 years. He's a philosopher. There's accounts of him as a kind of alchemist or magician, sometimes both simultaneously. There's even scholarly suggestions that Nagarjuna may actually refer to several different people. I'm saying that not to just destabilize your confidence in this as a source, but it's actually kind of illuminating. In the Mahayana tradition, these great teachings are understood to arise when they're needed, through causes and conditions, through a confluence of wisdom and circumstance. So whether this figure, Nagarjuna, was one person or several, a historical figure, a partially mythological one, the philosophy that his name comes from, the philosophy of Madhyamaka, is still one of the most sophisticated and penetrating intellectual achievements. Really a great contribution to the philosophical traditions in humanity. So the teachings of Madhyamaka are associated with this figure Nagarjuna. And there's a beautiful story of the teachings of the prajñāpāramitā, the perfection of wisdom teachings that are so central to this philosophy and to our course. And the story goes that these teachings had been entrusted to the Nagas, who are these serpent beings who dwell beneath the waters, and that Nagarjuna descended to the bottom of a lake to retrieve them. And I find that image deeply resonant, that kind of the going underwater, accessing something that lives beneath the surface of ordinary awareness, and something that we might associate with the unconscious, with creativity, with levels of knowing that purely discursive reasoning can't reach. And that's what these teachings are inviting us to do. I mean, when you think about the origin of these teachings, think about the realm of deep wisdom and creativity. We often refer to it as a well. So these teachings come from this very deep well. And the central concept in Nagarjuna's philosophy and the philosophy of Madhyamaka is śūnyatā. And this is generally translated into English as emptiness. In Tibetan, it's tongpani. And I want to say something important. I want to say something about this translation at the outset, because I think it causes some confusion. This word emptiness, śūnyatā, tongpani, it's not a void. It's not a kind of nihilistic void. And it's not a claim that nothing whatsoever exists in the way that we might think. So when English speakers hear emptiness, we tend to imagine a kind of bleak, meaningless vacuum. Everything stripped away, nothing remaining, a kind of blank room. But I think it's helpful to understand it in Sanskrit. There's the word garbha, and this word tathagata garbha, which is related to the concept of Buddha nature. And this word garbha it's the womb. So we look at these teachings on Buddha nature, which emerge from the same philosophical stream. Garbha carries a sense of a space where something can arise through causes and conditions. So not empty in the sense of barren, but open in the sense of generative. A womb isn't an empty space. A womb is the very condition for something to come into being. So I want you to think about that image when we think about emptiness. We also, if we can look at the sky, we can look out into space and understand that what is there isn't something that is totally void. It's space itself. So I just want to encourage you to play around with this word emptiness and think about the parts of it, empty and ness, and that the empty part is pointing towards an insight that things lack fixed, independent, inherent existence. And the ness part is the potentiality, the possibility, the ground from which things can arise. And these two qualities begin together. They're inseparable. So emptiness doesn't mean nothing exists. What we're studying here, what we're going to be exploring here is these teachings of Madhyamaka, the teachings of Nagarjuna, is that nothing possesses inherent, independent, fixed existence, that everything arises through causes and conditions. Now that might sound modest, but it isn't. Consider what it implies. Take any object around you right now. I have a cup of tea. Of course I do. But I have a cup of tea. But take any object around you right now. A cup, a chair, your phone. You experience it as a solid, distinct, independent thing. It seems to exist in its own right, from its own side, as a unified object. But look at it more carefully. The cup is made of clay or glass, or in my case, ceramic, which came from the earth and formed over millions of years through geological processes, which required specific atmospheric and chemical conditions. So it exists in relation also to the hand that holds it, the heat it contains, the purpose it serves. If you remove the causes and conditions, there is no cup. The cup doesn't exist independently. It arises dependently. There's a few different examples that I love to use when I'm teaching this in my classes at Naropa. There's the astronomer and astrophysicist Carl Sagan. There's a quote from one of his books that feels so Madhyamaka. And he says, if you wish to make an apple pie from scratch, you must first invent the universe. The point that he's making is there's no truly independent from scratch. Every ingredient in an apple pie, the wheat, the apples, the sugar, the butter, is the product of billions of years of cosmic, geological, biological, and agricultural causation. The apple didn't just appear. It required supernovae to form carbon atoms, planetary formation, the evolution of flowering plants, pollinating insects, soil ecosystems, water cycles, sunlight. You cannot separate the pie from the universe that produced it. So this is the point about dependent arising. The apple pie has no inherent independent existence. It arises through an inconceivably vast web of causes and conditions. It's empty of an intrinsic apple pie-ness that exists from its own side. The great Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh has this beautiful teaching, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's his famous interbeing teaching, and he illustrates it through a sheet of paper and invites us to look deeply into the paper and see what's in a piece of paper. In a piece of paper, there's a cloud, because without clouds, there's no rain. Without rain, the trees don't grow. Without trees, there's no paper. So the cloud is in the paper. And then there's the logger who cut the tree, and the logger's parents, and the food that sustained them, the sun, the soil, the minerals. Everything in the cosmos has contributed to bringing this one sheet of paper into existence. And he coins the word interbeing for this. The paper inter-is with the clouds, with the sun, with the logger. If you were to remove any of those elements, the cloud, the sunshine, the people, the paper could not exist. And if you look closely, you cannot find a self that independently exists within the paper. It's empty of a separate self. And then if we think of something truly existing, we tend to think that it must be either a unified whole or made of many parts. And then we might fall into the idea that those parts exist. But when we investigate, we can't find the unity. Every seemingly unified thing dissolves when examined, and every part dissolves into smaller parts. You can keep dividing, keep analyzing, and you never arrive at an indivisible, truly existing unit in terms of Madhyamaka style investigation of a self. What you find instead is a vast dynamic web of interconnection, causes and conditions all the way down. Like peeling an onion, there's no essential center. And so the same analysis applies to the self. There's no permanent fixed you sitting behind your eyes, unchanged across time, independent of your relationships and history and the biochemical processes happening in your body right now. What we call self is a dynamic process, a stream of arising moments, shaped by causes and conditions, held together by a kind of useful fiction of a continuous narrative. So this is also part of what we'll be exploring in relation to self, and it can be destabilizing. So it's really helpful to have stability and meditation and practice to do this kind of work, this inquiry. And I kind of I want to shift slightly and just bring in a little bit about Western philosophy here, just so that, especially when we're talking about this analysis of self, I think it's interesting to consider how Western philosophy also really tries to get to a similar point, because there's a kind of strikingly parallel place in Western philosophy. There's a European philosopher called Martin Heidegger in the 20th century who presented a challenge to this Descartes, this Cartesian idea of self. So this I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum. Descartes proposed that if you strip away everything, away, the body, the senses, the external world, everything uncertain, you arrive at this bedrock. I think, therefore I am. A pure, self-contained, independently existing subject. So then another philosopher, Heidegger, says, nope. Strip away your relationships, your language, your history, your embeddedness in a world of meaning. You don't find a real self hiding underneath. The self doesn't precede the context, it arises through it. So this is actually remarkably close to the teachings of Madhyamaka. What both of these things are saying is the assumption of an intrinsic, isolated, independently existing self is mistaken upon analysis. But Buddhism takes this a little further, I would say. One is, well, what do you do with that? One is don't just rely upon what someone else says, this is what's happening, or this philosophy is true. Investigate it for yourself. Because then that insight, if it just remains largely philosophical, it becomes a kind of correction to, or a response to, another philosophical point. But what the Buddhist tradition does, and Madhyamaka philosophy, both practice and inquiry, says this insight fully realized, not just understood intellectually, but really accessed in direct experience, is the path out of suffering. So what Buddhism offers that maybe some other philosophical traditions, Western philosophy, I'm not saying completely it does that, but what Buddhism does offer is this technology of transformation, methods, practices, a path for actually living from that understanding rather than merely just thinking it. So it's not just to study those ideas, but let them land somewhere deeper. So I'm wondering, hopefully you can put some comments and I'll see them later in the chat. But I'm hopefully that this resonates somewhat with your own contemplative practice, your own observation. You don't need to respond to that, but just hold that. Let that be a live question, an open question with you. And I'll talk a little bit about this word Madhyamaka, or the middle way. What's it in the middle of? Between two extremes. So we approached that a little bit earlier. What if nothing has a fixed way or a fixed existence? If nothing has inherent existence, does that lead straight to a kind of nihilistic viewpoint? If nothing truly exists, why does anything matter? Why practice? Why have compassion? Why help others? Why get out of bed? But this is exactly why it's called Madhyamaka, or the middle way. The middle between eternalism and nihilism, these two extremes. So this philosophy, these teachings, these practices navigate between the view that things possess permanent, fixed, independent existence. In its most obvious form, a belief in a permanent soul or self that persists unchanged through life and even beyond death. But there's even a subtler, more kind of pervasive form of eternalism, and it's sort of like how we operate most of the time, which is simply the habit of relating to things as if they're solid, fixed, and permanent. Your sense of identity, your political position, the story you tell yourself about who you are, the certainty that your perceptions of other people accurately capture something real about them. All of those things are these ways that are actually a kind of extreme that get fixed. Now, nihilism, on the other hand, draws, it takes logical conclusion from discovering that if nothing is fixed, then nothing matters. Causality is random. There's no real consequences to actions. If the self is fiction, then wouldn't ethics be optional? I can do what I want. So from a Buddhist point of view, that's just not philosophically wrong, but it's also genuinely harmful because it's a mental state that tends to generate suffering for oneself and others. So Madhyamaka, in a sort of radical position, insists that both of those things are mistaken. Things are not fixed and inherently existing, but things that arise, function, interact, and have consequences. So the cup doesn't exist from its own side as some eternal independent object, but if I drop it, it will still break. I'm going to drink a bit of tea. The self is not a permanent, independent entity, but your actions still generate karmic consequences that affect your experience and the experience of others. Conventional reality appears, it's just not ultimately real. So this brings us to the two truths. It's a very important and useful conceptual tool that Madhyamaka offers, this teaching on the two truths. There's ultimate truth, the level at which, under rigorous analysis, we discover that things lack inherent existence, that phenomena are empty of fixed essence, that nothing can be found that exists permanently from its own side. And then there's conventional truth. And this is the level at which things function. Language communicates, causes produce effects, cups hold tea, and people's actions have real consequences for themselves and others. These are not two separate realities. Nagarjuna is actually quite emphatic on this point. The ultimate truth doesn't cancel out conventional truth. The fact that money has no ultimate inherent existence doesn't mean you can stop paying your bills. The fact that emotions arise dependently rather than existing as fixed, substantial entities doesn't mean your grief isn't real or that your happiness doesn't matter. So understanding the ultimate truth actually enriches your engagement with conventional reality because you're no longer rigidly grasping at it or sort of panicked by its impermanence. There isn't a kind of desperate trying to fix what is by nature fluid. So think about what this means for relationships. We are constantly experiencing other people through a dense filter of our own projections and our own histories and expectations. And modern cognitive science confirms this. We never directly perceive another person's reality. We experience our own mental construction of them. Now, there's another philosophical stream, which if any of you want to study Madhyamaka and want to go onto the third turning, there's the teachings of Yogacara, which takes that further, that what we experience as the world around us is our own projections shaped by karma and memory and thoughts and emotion, not fabricated from nothing, but deeply conditioned by our own mental states. But the teaching here, the instruction here is understanding that all of this doesn't mean withdrawing from relationship. It means holding your perceptions of others with openness, with compassion, and humility. And it means recognizing that the rigid, fixed story you have about yourself or who someone else is, and especially who they are in relation to you, is a story. Sometimes beautiful, sometimes difficult, challenging. But here's something really important. Mental states of clinging can begin to transform the moment you relinquish clinging to the object. So when the grip loosens, something can be liberated. So how do you proceed once you have this kind of insight? What do you actually do with it? And this is really where, how does this framework of these teachings of Madhyamaka become a practical tool? Because how do we work with it? The Two Truths teaching isn't just a kind of philosophical conceit, it's a methodology. On one level, a rigorous analysis of the ultimate nature of things. On the other, the conventional level of how we actually move through the world, how we interact, how we relate. And these two levels of understanding of investigation belong together. Without relying on conventional truth, then the meaning of the ultimate can't be explained. Without understanding the ultimate, you can't liberate. So you can't bypass one to reach the other. They're mutually dependent. They arise together. So these teachings of Madhyamaka, the aim is to short circuit clinging at the root, not by denying that anything exists, but by dissolving the kind of conceptual scaffolding that keeps us locked in suffering. And it's an offering us a way of kind of breaking out or shedding that scaffolding to step out of a kind of constraint of reified concepts into something much more direct. So it's a method towards direct experience and offers practices that engage with reality in a way that doesn't need to negate thinking, but cultivates present moment, wakeful engagement, not a frozen world of fixed identity and rigid concepts, but living a kind of fluid, luminous quality of awareness. It isn't locked down by clinging. Now, one of the key teachings of the Mahayana is the Heart Sutra. And this is where compassion comes in. So the Heart Sutra, this classic teaching on emptiness and this classic sutra of the Mahayana tradition, it's quite provocative. I mean, in terms of like, it's sort of it pokes you. And it's really at the center of like the second turning. It's one of the most recited texts in the whole Mahayana Buddhist world. And the word provocative comes to mind. It's a short text. You can read the whole thing in a few minutes. And in those few minutes, it systematically dismantles everything. Form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. No eyes, no ears, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no senses, no perception, no mental formations, no consciousness. It's just like, no, 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 no. Whatever you think is there isn't there. But what isn't there is everywhere. And this sutra deconstructs the Buddhist path. It is, as one scholar translator has described hazardous to your samsaric sanity. The scholar Karl Brunholz, who's written quite a lot on the Heart Sutra, he has a wonderful way of understanding its scope. So the collection, the Prajñāpāramitā sutras, of which the Heart Sutra is really, is one of the central of this whole collection. Let's say it had like 21 or 20,000 pages of this collection. It would be 20,000 pages of no. I think there's one teaching in this collection where the Buddha, he gathers everybody together, says, all right, we're going to have a teaching, and the entire teaching is the letter A. And then everyone rejoiced. And it said that are people that realize the full perfection of wisdom through hearing or reading just that one letter. So these teachings aren't primarily philosophical argument to be intellectually mastered. Of course, that's part of it, but it's also a kind of contemplative provocation and a way to short circuit clinging. An invitation. But where does compassion come in? Compassion is the heart of emptiness. There's something essential about the Heart Sutra that's easy to miss. And I want to sort of name it explicitly because it really matters for how we understand what we're going to learn in this course. The Heart Sutra is unique amongst the Prajñāpāramitā sutras in that it features Avalokiteshvara, the great bodhisattva of compassion, as its primary speaker. This isn't just incidental or coincidental. It's the teaching's heart. The scriptures even use the phrase emptiness with a heart of compassion. Emptiness, śūnyatā, is the heart of the Mahayana, and the heart of śūnyatā is compassion. And that's why the teachings of Madhyamaka should never be understood as a kind of cold philosophical deconstruction, because the analysis of śūnyatā, emptiness, is not an end in and of itself. It's in service of bodhicitta, of awakened heart-mind. The aspiration not merely to be liberated from suffering oneself, but to dedicate one's own practice to the liberation of all beings. And that's what's sort of a remarkable and beautiful thing about these teachings, understanding that nothing has inherent existence, really understanding it, not just intellectually agreeing with it. It doesn't produce indifference. It's the absolute opposite. When you stop grasping at a rigid, separate self, the boundary between my suffering and your suffering becomes much more permeable. The contraction of like ego protection loosens, and what flows in to fill that space, if one is walking on a path of the bodhisattva, is compassion. Natural, spontaneous, boundless compassion, not as an obligation or an achievement, but as the natural expression of a mind that has understood emptiness. Another really important figure in studying Mahayana is Shantideva, the 8th century Indian scholar and teacher, who is the produced the Bodhicharvatara, the way of the Bodhisattva. Another core text that we'll look at when we go through this course, this 5-week course. And in that text, bodhicitta, the awakened heart mind, is the wish to go and the going itself. So the aspiration and the path are inseparable. So that was a lot. And I'll just walk you briefly through the terrain of what the course that we're offering. the terrain of the next 5 weeks, what that will look like. So you have a sense of how the course will progress and what you'll be learning. So we'll begin with tracing the middle way, following this radical expansion of that same principle into a philosophical framework. That will be the first week. So I'll try to kind of, I love, I'm a historian, so I love giving the history lesson, but I'll try to make it kind of a fun story. But just kind of situating ourselves in terms of where does this fit in terms of the development of Buddhism and Mahayana. And then in week 2, we'll confront the teachings of emptiness. Emptiness isn't nothing. And we'll use examples from ecology, from economics and relationships to demonstrate how things exist through their connection, their interconnectedness, rather than an independent essence. And hopefully we'll start to see that emptiness is not just a philosophical abstraction, but is something that you can actually observe directly in your own experience. And then in week 3, we'll bring these teachings of the two truths. How do these work in our daily life? Exploring through practical examples how conventional and ultimate truth relate to each other, and how understanding both levels can reduce suffering whilst deepening engagement. Then in week 4, we'll turn to analysis of the self, deconstructing the self. We'll use guided meditations to explore how the sense of I, me, and my arises moment to moment through thoughts and sensations and stories, and connect this to how we work with identity and the narratives we have around it, and how having a less rigid concept about that turns out to enable greater flexibility and more genuine compassion. And then in the final week of the course, we'll ask, what does all this mean for how I actually live? Practical integration. How does a perspective of these teaching, how can those transform work and spiritual practice, and how understanding the teachings of dependent origination naturally gives rise to compassion, to ethics, and joyful engagement with life. And each session will have some meditation. We'll always ground this intellectual material in direct experience. We won't leave it to float in the abstract. There'll be small group discussions to explore how these concepts can apply to your actual situations. And we'll practice really contemplative inquiry, not just hearing ideas, but really actively examining your own assumptions about permanence, interdependence, and the self. So why this course? Why now? I want to close with something that might feel a bit large, but I think it's the honest framing for why offer this now, why study this now. I think that these teachings offer really practical tools for the challenges that we find ourselves in the moment. The overwhelm of information overload, understanding that you don't need to grasp any single narrative as ultimate truth, that can be genuinely freeing. The political polarization that we're experiencing, these teachings can really show us how to see how positions arise through causes and conditions, rather than representing fixed and fundamental essences. There's the openness or the possibility of genuine dialogue. We have a lot of anxiety about the future, and these teachings can help us understand about outcomes arising through interdependent conditions rather than being controlled by any fixed entity, including yourself. And that's sort of weirdly stabilizing for me. We're in this kind of culture of consumer culture, recognizing that the self that's supposedly satisfied by each new purchase has no inherent stable existence. It takes some of the desperation out of some of the cycles that we find ourselves in. So I want us to approach this philosophy as medicine, because that's how it was understood in its original context, not as intellectual entertainment, not as a game of conceptual sophistication, but as a technology for reducing unnecessary mental suffering while remaining fully, compassionately, and joyfully engaged with life. So I'm not teaching Madhyamaka here as an academic. This is not an academic course. And not quite exactly as a Dharma teacher either, but from what I am, which is a scholar practitioner. So we'll be drawing from primary sources, but using those for practical application. But really, the intention here is that you may be, as I am, feeling keenly the complexity and the turbulence of this moment, and you're right to be freaked out. The teachings of Madhyamaka are not a simple, comfortable panacea. It's not a sedative. It will challenge you. It may at certain moments feel destabilizing in precisely the ways that I've described, but on the other side of that destabilization, or it may be even better through it, is something really extraordinarily valuable. Not solid ground exactly, but the ability to stand. Resilience, the capacity to act, to love, to practice without requiring the ground to be solid. And so that's what this that capacity is what these teachings are pointing towards. And this is what we'll be doing in that course. So I hope that's given you some information. And I'm going to stop because I believe I've spoken for about an hour. And thank you for listening. And I can stay on for a few more minutes if there are any questions. I have to put my glasses on for this. And I'll see this. I have a question. As a former evangelical, I find the fear-based religious system in America rather corrupt. How can I practice peace and respect for those that push this on others? Could you post the question back up again so I can see it as I'm, thank you. I think that there's so many parts of many different wisdom traditions or religion that can operate through fear. So I don't want to single out any one tradition or path, because I also know evangelical traditions and people who practice in those who are some of the, really ethical, kind people, and are not, it's not about fear. But I think at the very core, at the very root, is that suffering is present. And when you're able to really deeply relate to that what is happening is that people are trying to hold on to something because they're suffering and they're afraid. And that's the root of where that is coming from. And the root of that is the kind of ignoring, from a Buddhist perspective anyway, is that you're ignoring reality as it actually is rather than the way we want it to be. So in terms of practicing peace and respect, that's what the Bodhisattva path is all about. It's about developing the perfection. So the Bodhisattva path is the paramitas. There's developing patience. There's developing discipline. All of these things, all of the ways that you work on that path as a bodhisattva is to address that so that you can operate through the world that way. So the bodhisattva path is no joke. I mean, taking that vow means that you promise to show up, to be an inspiration and to others. And it's continuous work. It's how do you meet someone else in that moment? this is something that is a larger answer, but it's through developing the view and it's through developing practical ways that allow you to kind of stand on unstable ground without it affecting you in the same way and just showing up rather than having a fixed sense of self and a fixed idea about who somebody else is. And kind of radiating some compassion can actually really cut through some of that fear-based solidity. Okay, one more question. Matt. I think you have to come to the course for me to answer that. I don't know if I can go into that in a few minutes. How might Nagarjuna's teaching on emptiness relate to Einstein's relational view of space and time? Yes, in a lot of ways, and it would take me a little bit longer. I'm sorry, I don't mean to not answer your question, but I think I'd rather have more time for that one.
Thank you so
Putting
much.
me on the spot there. I'm going to put that, I will put that in the course and we can talk about it, but I need another 20 minutes for that.
Thank you so much. And we are very much looking forward to joining you for that course and furthering this fascinating discussion. And thank you on behalf of everyone here for your very clear and lucid discussion of what's clearly a very subtle and deep teaching. Thank you for your sharing today. We so appreciate all the wisdom and compassion that you bring, Dr. Amelia Hall. Thank you. Now, Losar traditionally finishes with a tsok feast, and today we have a feast of offerings coming up this March. Lama Tsultrim will be teaching a new Dharma cycle, The Rain That Fulfills All Wishes, the sadhana of Amelia Junma. That's on March 19th to 22nd online and in Encinitas, California. For all other offerings, including Feeding Your Demons, Level 1, Level 2, and the Mandala Method Journey into the Union of the Sacred Feminine and Masculine, please see the links in the chat and our calendar page. And finally, we'll be back for our next Lama Live on 15th of March. Lopen Robin will be talking about her upcoming retreat, Minding the Gap, the bardo of this life. That's coming up on March 28th to 29th, and Lama Live is on the 15th. We so hope to see you there. Till then, goodbye.
Mangalam Shri Swaha. Om Tare Tu Re. Mangalam Shri Swaha. Om Tare Tu Re.